On the morning of March 21st, 1945, at precisely 11:14 a.m. Copenhagen time, the impossible happened. 8 de Havilland Mosquito bombers, flying at rooftop level through the heart of a densely populated European capital, released their bombs directly into the windows of the 6-story Shellhus building, the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, Denmark. The aircraft were traveling at over 300 miles per hour, barely 50 feet above the cobblestone streets, their wingtips almost grazing the buildings on either side. Inside that fortified concrete structure, more than 30 Danish resistance fighters sat in cells on the top floor, awaiting execution. They had been placed there deliberately by the Gestapo, human shields meant to deter exactly this kind of attack. The raid lasted less than 11 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the Gestapo's most valuable intelligence files had been incinerated. The names of thousands of resistance members, information that would have led to mass arrests and executions, had been reduced to ash. And against all odds, 18 prisoners managed to escape through the chaos and flames, crawling through shattered windows and climbing down fire escapes while German guards scrambled for cover below. This was Operation Carthage, one of the most audacious and controversial precision strikes of the Second World War. If you find this story as incredible as I do, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories of extraordinary courage and impossible missions that shaped our world. Now, let's go back to where this remarkable operation began. To understand why the Royal Air Force agreed to such a dangerous mission, flying heavy bombers at treetop level through a city of 1 million civilians, you need to understand what was happening in Denmark in the spring of 1945. Denmark had been under German occupation since April 9th, 1940. On that day, German forces had crossed the border at 4 in the morning, and by breakfast, the Danish government had surrendered to avoid the destruction of Copenhagen. It was the shortest military campaign of the war, lasting just 6 hours. The Germans promised that Denmark would retain its sovereignty, that life would continue as normal, and that the occupation would be benign. For the first 3 years, this arrangement held an uneasy peace. The Danish government cooperated with the Germans. Factories produced goods for the Reich. The Danish police maintained order, and the German occupiers, mindful that Denmark was supposed to be a model of peaceful collaboration, kept their brutality mostly hidden. But beneath the surface, resistance was growing. Danish citizens organized underground newspapers. Factory workers sabotaged production. Fishermen ferried refugees to Sweden, and a network of resistance cells began conducting acts of sabotage against German installations, rail lines, and military equipment. By 1943, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. A wave of strikes and sabotage operations prompted the Germans to declare martial law. The Danish government resigned rather than participate in repression. The Danish police were disarmed and deported to concentration camps. And the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, took direct control of maintaining order in Denmark. The man they put in charge was SS Obersturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Hoffmann. He established his headquarters in a building that Danes knew well, the Shellhus, a 6-story office complex that had once housed the Shell Oil Company. The building sat in the heart of Copenhagen, surrounded by residential neighborhoods, schools, churches, and hospitals. Its location was no accident. Hoffmann understood that the Allies would never risk bombing such a densely populated area. Under Hoffmann's command, the Gestapo launched a systematic campaign to destroy the Danish resistance. They employed a network of informers. They used torture to extract confessions and names, and they developed an extensive filing system that tracked every suspected resistance member in the country. By early 1945, the Gestapo's campaign was working. Resistance networks were being rolled up one by one. Key leaders were being arrested, interrogated, and executed. The files in Shellhus contained the names of thousands of Danes, farmers, teachers, doctors, housewives, anyone who had aided the resistance in any way. If those files remained intact, the Gestapo would be able to arrest and execute hundreds more before the war ended. The situation became critical in February 1945. The Gestapo arrested Professor Mogens Fogh, one of the most important resistance leaders in Denmark. Fogh knew everything: the names of cell leaders, the locations of safe houses, the details of upcoming operations. If the Gestapo broke him under torture, the entire resistance network would be compromised. The Danish resistance made a desperate decision. They sent a message to London through their SOE contact, a young man named Sven Truelsen. The message was simple but extraordinary. They were requesting that the Royal Air Force bomb the Gestapo headquarters with the full knowledge that Danish prisoners, including their own leaders, were being held on the top floors. This was not a request made lightly. The resistance leaders understood that some of their own people would almost certainly die in such an attack. But they calculated that the destruction of the Gestapo files and the disruption of their operations would save far more lives in the long run. Better to lose 30 prisoners than to have 3,000 resistance members arrested and executed. The request landed on the desk of Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry, the commander of No. 2 Group, Bomber Command. Embry was known throughout the RAF as a maverick, a pilot who had been shot down twice and escaped from German captivity both times, once by strangling a guard with his bare hands. He understood the resistance's desperation, and he believed that precision bombing at low altitude could work. But there was a problem. RAF Bomber Command had strict policies against low-level daylight raids over occupied cities. The risk of civilian casualties was simply too high. The bombers might miss their targets. They might hit schools, hospitals, or apartment buildings. The political and humanitarian consequences would be catastrophic. Embry fought for the mission anyway. He argued that the Mosquitos, the fastest bomber in the RAF inventory, was uniquely suited for precision attacks. Made almost entirely of wood, it could fly faster and lower than any other aircraft. Its pilots were trained in pinpoint accuracy. And the destruction of Gestapo headquarters would deliver a devastating blow to German intelligence operations across Scandinavia. The debate went all the way to Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the commander of Bomber Command, and beyond him to the War Cabinet itself. For weeks, the request was studied, debated, and delayed. Time was running out. Every day that passed, more resistance members were being arrested, more files were being compiled, more names were being added to the execution lists. Finally, in early March 1945, authorization came through. The raid was approved, with conditions. It had to be executed with absolute precision. Civilian casualties had to be minimized, and if the weather was not perfect, the mission would be scrubbed immediately. The man chosen to lead the attack was Group Captain Bob Bateson, a veteran of dozens of precision raids. Bateson assembled a force of 18 Mosquito bombers from 3 different squadrons: 21 Squadron, 464 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, and 487 Squadron of the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Each aircraft would carry 2 500-pound bombs with 11-second delay fuses, enough time for the bombs to penetrate the building's concrete walls before detonating. The plan was audacious in its complexity. The bombers would fly from their base at Fursfield in Norfolk, crossing the North Sea at wave-top level to avoid German radar. They would approach Copenhagen from the west, following railway lines and canals that would serve as visual landmarks. 3 separate waves would attack the Shellhus from different angles, each wave 30 seconds apart. The first wave would blow open the building's facade. The second wave would send their bombs through the gaps created by the first. The third wave would complete the destruction. Fighter escort would be provided by 30 Mustang fighters from 64 Squadron and 126 Squadron. Their job was to suppress anti-aircraft fire and deal with any German fighters that might scramble to intercept. On the evening of March 20th, Bateson gathered his crews for final briefings. He showed them detailed models of the Shellhus building, constructed from intelligence photographs. He walked them through every turn, every landmark, every second of the approach. He explained that Danish prisoners were being held on the top floors, and that despite this knowledge, the resistance had specifically requested the raid. The weather forecast for March 21st was marginal. Low clouds and drizzle were expected over Denmark. Some officers argued for postponement, but Bateson made the decision to proceed. The resistance could not wait any longer. At 8:55 a.m. on March 21st, 1945, 18 Mosquito bombers lifted off from Fursfield into a gray English morning. They formed up over the North Sea, dropping down to just 50 feet above the waves to avoid radar detection. Behind them, the Mustang fighters took up escort positions. The crossing took nearly 2 hours. The crews flew in radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning in visual landmarks. The tension in each cockpit was palpable. Every pilot knew that the margin for error was essentially zero. One wrong turn, one moment of inattention, and they would fly directly into the side of a building. As they crossed the Danish coast near Jutland, the weather deteriorated. Low clouds hung over the landscape. Drizzle streaked across cockpit canopies. But the crews pressed on, dropping even lower to maintain visual contact with the ground. At 11 Sim, the formation reached the outskirts of Copenhagen. The pilots could see the spires of churches, the red-tiled roofs of apartment buildings, the streets filled with pedestrians going about their morning routines. Most Danes had no idea what was about to happen. Wing Commander Klebo led the first wave of 6 aircraft toward the target. He had memorized every detail of the approach: the canal they would follow, the church steeple that marked the final turn, the gap between buildings that would lead them directly to the Shellhus. At 11:14 a.m., the first bomb struck the building. The explosions were devastating. Concrete walls that had seemed impenetrable crumbled under the impact. Windows shattered outward in cascading waves of glass. Flames erupted from the lower floors, where the Gestapo's archives were stored. Inside the building, chaos reigned. German guards scrambled for cover. Gestapo officers tried to save burning files. And on the top floor, Danish prisoners, who had heard the approaching aircraft and guessed what was happening, threw themselves to the floor of their cells as the building shook around them. The second wave came in 30 seconds later, exactly as planned. Their bombs found the gaps created by the first attack, penetrating deep into the building's interior. More fires erupted, more walls collapsed. The shell hiss was being torn apart from within. But then disaster struck. One of the Mosquitos in the second wave, piloted by Wing Commander Klibo himself, was hit by anti-aircraft fire just seconds before releasing its bombs. The aircraft shuddered, its port engine trailing smoke. Klibo fought to maintain control, but the Mosquito was too low, moving too fast. It clipped a light pole, cartwheeled through the air, and crashed into the ground, directly beside a building that the crews had not seen on their intelligence photographs. It was the Jeanne d'Arc School, a Catholic institution run by French nuns. At that moment, it was filled with more than 400 children. The burning wreckage of Klibo's aircraft ignited the school's lower floors. Other pilots in the third wave, seeing the smoke and flames, mistook the burning school for the Shellhuis. Several of them released their bombs on the school, believing they were completing the attack on the Gestapo headquarters. The results were catastrophic. The school's walls collapsed inward. Children who had been sitting at their desks moments before were buried under tons of rubble. Nuns rushed to evacuate students, pulling children from burning classrooms, even as more bombs fell. By the time the attack was over, 125 people had died in the school, 86 children and 18 adults among them. It was the worst civilian disaster of any RAF precision raid during the entire war. But the crews who had successfully attacked the Shellhuis knew nothing of this tragedy as they turned for home. They had seen their bombs strike the Gestapo headquarters. They had seen the flames rising from the building's windows. They believed the mission had been accomplished. And in one terrible, complicated sense, it had been. The attack on the Shellhuis killed an estimated 55 German personnel, including several senior Gestapo officers. More importantly, it destroyed virtually all of the intelligence files that the Gestapo had compiled on the Danish resistance. Thousands of names, thousands of addresses, thousands of carefully documented connections. All of it was reduced to ash in the fires that swept through the building's archive rooms. The confusion caused by the attack also allowed 18 prisoners to escape from the burning building. Some climbed down fire escapes. Others jumped from windows into the arms of Danish civilians who had gathered to watch the raid. Still others walked calmly out the front door while German guards were occupied fighting the fires. Among those who escaped was Mogens Fogg, the resistance leader whose arrest had triggered the request for the raid in the first place. Fogg had been scheduled for execution that very week. Instead, he walked free from the burning Shellhuis and immediately resumed his leadership of the resistance movement. The days following the raid were a strange mixture of triumph and tragedy for Copenhagen. The destruction of Gestapo headquarters dealt a crippling blow to German intelligence operations in Denmark. The surviving resistance networks were able to operate with renewed effectiveness in the final weeks of the war. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Denmark's resistance movement emerged largely intact, something that would not have been possible if the Gestapo files had survived. But the cost had been horrific. The children of the Jeanne d'Arc school were buried in mass graves while their parents wept. The French nuns who had cared for them were left to piece together their shattered community, and the pilots who had accidentally bombed the school carried that guilt for the rest of their lives. Group Captain Bateson, who had led the mission, was initially hailed as a hero, but when the full extent of the school tragedy became known, he fell into a deep depression. He would later say that not a day passed when he did not think about those children whose deaths he had inadvertently caused while trying to save thousands of others. The ethical complexities of Operation Carthage have been debated ever since. Was it justified to risk so many civilian lives to destroy intelligence files and rescue prisoners? Would more people have died if the raid had never happened? How should we weigh the children who died against the resistance members who were saved? These are questions without easy answers. War forces impossible choices upon those who fight it. The Danish resistance asked for this raid knowing that their own comrades might die. The RAF crews flew the mission knowing that any mistake could kill hundreds of innocents. And in the end, both the best and worst possibilities came true. The Shellhuis building itself was eventually demolished. A memorial now stands in its place, honoring both the resistance members who were freed and the Germans who died in the attack. A few blocks away, another memorial marks the site of the Jeanne d'Arc School, where 86 children lost their lives in the final months of a war they never asked to be part of. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Operation Carthage is the freedom that Denmark enjoys today. In the weeks after the raid, the Danish resistance was able to operate without fear of mass arrests. They coordinated with Allied forces to ensure a peaceful transition when Germany surrendered, and they helped establish the democratic government that has governed Denmark ever since. The children who died at the Jeanne d'Arc school did not die in vain, though that truth offers little comfort to those who loved them. Their deaths were part of the terrible price that Denmark paid for its freedom. and the pilots who accidentally killed them were themselves casualties of the raid, carrying wounds that no medal could heal and no victory could erase. Let us return now to the cockpit of one of those Mosquito bombers, because it is there, in the minds and hearts of the men who flew the mission, that we can truly understand what happened on that terrible, triumphant morning. Flight Lieutenant Peter Lake was just 23 years old when he climbed into his Mosquito on the morning of March 21st, 1945. He had flown 37 combat missions over occupied Europe. He had seen friends die in burning aircraft. He had dropped bombs on railway yards, bridges, and ammunition depots, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to do. The briefing the night before had been unlike any other. Instead of the usual targets, military installations, industrial facilities, they had been shown photographs of a building in the middle of a city. Not just any city, but Copenhagen, the capital of an Allied nation under occupation. And not just any building, but the Gestapo headquarters, where Danish prisoners were being held on the top floors. Peter remembered the silence in the briefing room when Group Captain Bateson explained the situation. The resistance had requested the raid. They knew their own people might die. They had calculated that destroying the Gestapo files was worth the sacrifice. It was a lot to ask of a 23-year-old pilot. But Peter understood the stakes. He had heard stories about what the Gestapo did to captured resistance members. He knew that thousands of names were sitting in filing cabinets inside that building. Names that would become death sentences if the files survived. His navigator was a young Scotsman named James McPherson. They had flown together for nearly a year, developing the kind of unspoken communication that comes from trusting your life to another person dozens of times over. James had a wife and baby daughter waiting for him back in Edinburgh. He kept a photograph of them tucked into the pocket of his flight suit. As they crossed the North Sea that morning, flying so low that the spray from the waves occasionally struck their windscreen, Peter found himself thinking about the prisoners in the shellhouse. What must it be like to sit in a cell, waiting for execution, knowing that your only hope was an attack that might kill you? Did they know the raid was coming? Would they have time to take cover? He pushed the thoughts aside. There would be time for reflection later, if he survived. For now he needed to focus on the task at hand, flying a twin-engine bomber through a city at 300 miles per hour. 50 feet above the ground, in order to place 2 bombs precisely through the windows of a specific building. The approach to Copenhagen was a blur of green fields, red rooftops, and gray sky. Peter had memorized every landmark: the railway junction at Roskilde, the canal that led into the city, the church steeple that marked the final turn. But seeing them in real life, rushing past at incredible speed, was different from studying photographs in a briefing room. He was part of the third wave, following 30 seconds behind the first 2 attacks. As they approached the target area, he could see smoke rising from the center of the city. The first bombs had already struck. The shellhouse was burning. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was another column of smoke, separate from the first, rising from a building several blocks away. It was thick and black, the kind of smoke that comes from a large fire. And there were people, tiny figures visible even from the air, running in the streets below. His radio crackled with confused chatter. Something had gone wrong. One of the aircraft had gone down. There was mention of a school. But there was no time to process what he was hearing. The shellhouse was directly ahead, flames pouring from its shattered windows. Peter lined up his approach, made his final adjustments, and released his bombs. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as the weight dropped away. He banked hard left, pulling away from the target as quickly as possible. Below and behind him, he heard the delayed explosions as his bombs detonated inside the building. And then he was climbing, heading for home, leaving Copenhagen's burning skyline behind him. It was only later, after they had landed safely back at First Field, that Peter learned the full truth about what had happened. Wing Commander Klebo's aircraft had been hit by flak. It had crashed beside a school. Other pilots, seeing the burning school and mistaking it for the target, had dropped their bombs on it. More than 80 children were dead. Peter Lake never flew another combat mission. The war ended 6 weeks later. He returned to England, married his childhood sweetheart, took a job as a civil aviation pilot. But he never forgot March 21st, 1945. He never forgot the smoke rising from that second building, or the tiny figures running in the streets below. Years later, in a letter to his grandson, he would write, "We did what we were asked to do. We destroyed the Gestapo headquarters and freed the prisoners. But we also killed children who had done nothing wrong, whose only crime was going to school on the wrong morning. I have spent my entire life trying to understand how both of those things can be true at the same time. I still don't have an answer." The story of Operation Carthage cannot be told without understanding the perspective of those who were inside the shellhouse when the bombs began to fall. Henrik Jensen was 27 years old, a schoolteacher from the small town of Odense who had joined the resistance in 1943. His cell had specialized in sabotaging railway lines, placing small explosive charges on tracks used to transport German military supplies. For 2 years, they had operated successfully, avoiding detection through careful tradecraft and luck. But in February 1945, luck had run out. A fellow resistance member broken under Gestapo torture had given up Henrik's name. He was arrested at his parents' home, dragged from his bedroom at 3 a.m, and transported to Copenhagen for interrogation. The Shellhus was unlike anything Henrik had imagined. From the outside, it looked like any other office building, a place where accountants might work, or insurance salesmen. But inside, it was a house of horrors. The basement contained cells where prisoners were kept in complete darkness. The middle floors housed interrogation rooms, equipped with tools of torture. And the top floor, where Henrik was eventually taken, held those who had been interrogated and were now awaiting execution. Henrik had been tortured for 3 days. They had beaten him, burned him with cigarettes, and subjected him to stress positions that left his muscles screaming in agony. But he had not broken. He had not given up any names, and so they had moved him to the top floor to await his death. The cell was small, barely large enough for the wooden cot that served as his bed. There was a single window, covered with bars, that looked out over the city. Through it, Henrik could see the spires of Copenhagen's churches, the red rooftops of apartment buildings, the ordinary life of a city going on without him. He had been told that his execution was scheduled for March 23rd, 2 more days. He had made his peace with death, or at least he thought he had. He spent his time praying, remembering his family, and thinking about the Denmark that would exist after the war, a Denmark he would never see. On the morning of March 21st, Henrik was lying on his cot when he heard a sound that made him sit up straight. Aircraft engines, low and fast, getting louder by the second. Before he could process what he was hearing, the building shook with a tremendous explosion. The walls vibrated. Plaster fell from the ceiling. Through his window he could see smoke and flame rising from the floors below. Henrik threw himself to the floor, covering his head with his arms. More explosions followed, each one closer than the last. The building groaned and shuddered. He could hear screaming from the floors below, German voices shouting in panic, the crack of gunfire, the roar of flames. And then, impossibly, there was silence. Henrik raised his head. The wall of his cell had cracked, a zigzag line running from floor to ceiling. Through the crack, he could see daylight, actual daylight, not the dim illumination of his cell window. The explosion had blown a hole in the building's exterior wall. He got to his feet and approached the crack. It was wide enough to squeeze through, but it opened onto a 6-story drop to the street below. He looked around frantically, searching for some way to descend. That was when he heard the voices. Other prisoners, freed from their cells by the explosions, were calling to each other in the corridor. Someone had found a fire escape, a metal staircase on the building's exterior that had survived the attack. Henrik squeezed through the crack in his cell wall and found himself on a narrow ledge overlooking the burning city. The fire escape was 20 feet away, accessible only by edging along the ledge. Below him, the street was chaos. German soldiers running in all directions, civilians staring up at the burning building, fire brigades struggling to approach through the debris. Henrik did not hesitate. He pressed his back against the wall and began moving along the ledge, inch by inch toward the fire escape. The wind tore at his prison clothes. Smoke stung his eyes, but he kept moving. When he reached the fire escape, he found 3 other prisoners already descending. They did not speak. There was no need. They simply climbed down together, step by step, until they reached the ground floor. The scene at street level was indescribable. The Shellhus was engulfed in flames. German soldiers were everywhere, but they were focused on fighting the fires and searching for survivors, not on escaped prisoners. Danish civilians had gathered to watch, and some of them, recognizing the prisoners by their ragged clothes, quickly stepped forward to help. A woman in a blue coat grabbed Henrik's arm and pulled him into the crowd. "Come with me," she whispered, quickly, before they notice. She led him through the maze of streets, away from the burning building, until they reached a small apartment 3 blocks away. Inside, her husband was waiting with civilian clothes, identity papers, and a cup of hot tea. "The resistance sent word that the raid was coming," the woman explained. "We were told to watch for escaping prisoners and help them get to safety." Henrik could barely comprehend what was happening. An hour ago, he had been awaiting execution. Now he was sitting in a stranger's living room, drinking tea and wearing borrowed clothes. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know to be there?" The woman smiled. "We are all part of the resistance, one way or another. Every person who hides a fugitive, every person who shares information, every person who refuses to cooperate with the Germans. We knew you might escape today. We were ready." Henrik lived to see the end of the war. He returned to teaching, married, and raised 3 children. He never forgot the woman in the blue coat, or the stranger who had given him clothes and tea on the most important morning of his life. And he never forgot the RAF pilots who had risked everything to give him that chance at freedom. But he also never forgot the sound of the explosions, or the sight of the flames, or the screams of the German guards trapped in the burning building. War had saved his life, but it had also shown him its true face, terrible, violent, and utterly without mercy. The tragedy at the Jeanne d'Arc school unfolded in the same 11 minutes, but in a completely different world. Sister Teresa was a French nun who had been teaching at the school for 15 years. She loved her students. The bright faces that greeted her each morning, the eager hands raised to answer questions, the laughter that filled the corridors between classes. The school served families from across Copenhagen, both Danish and French, Catholic and Protestant. It was a place of learning and joy. On the morning of March 21st, Sister Teresa was teaching mathematics to her class of third graders. They were working on multiplication tables, a tedious but necessary exercise that the children approached with varying degrees of enthusiasm. At approximately 11:14 a.m., she heard a sound she did not recognize, a deep roar, like thunder, but continuous, growing louder by the second. She went to the window to look. What she saw made no sense. Aircraft, large twin-engine aircraft painted in camouflage, were racing across the rooftops at incredible speed. They were so low that she could see the pilots in their cockpits, the bombs hanging beneath their wings, the insignia of the Royal Air Force on their fuselages. And then the world exploded. The first bombs did not hit the school. They struck the Schellis, several blocks away. But the shockwave reached the Jeanne d'Arc school within seconds, shattering windows and sending children screaming under their desks. Sister Teresa was trying to restore calm when she heard another sound. The terrifying shriek of an aircraft engine, much closer than before, followed by an enormous crash that shook the building to its foundations. Wing Commander Klebo's burning Mosquito had struck the ground beside the school. The impact had ruptured its fuel tanks, sending a wave of burning aviation fuel across the school's lower floors. Within seconds, the classrooms nearest the crash site were ablaze. Sister Teresa did not know any of this. All she knew was that fire was spreading through the building and that her children needed to escape. She grabbed the nearest students and began pushing them toward the door. "Move quickly, stay together, follow me." The corridor was filled with smoke. Other teachers were emerging from their classrooms, shepherding groups of terrified children toward the exits. The younger children were crying. The older ones were trying to be brave. Everyone was coughing from the smoke. They had almost reached the main staircase when the second wave of bombs fell. Several pilots in the third attack wave, seeing the smoke and flames from Klebo's crash, had mistaken the burning school for the Gestapo headquarters. They released their bombs on what they believed was the target. The explosions were catastrophic. The school's main staircase, the primary escape route, collapsed into rubble. Walls that had stood for decades crumbled like paper. Children who had been running toward safety were buried under tons of debris. Sister Teresa was thrown to the ground by the force of the blast. When she looked up, the corridor ahead of her no longer existed. Where the staircase had been, there was now only a mountain of broken stone and twisted metal. She turned back, gathered the children who could still walk, and led them toward a secondary exit she knew at the back of the building. The route took them past classrooms that had been reduced to ruins, past bodies of children and teachers who had not escaped in time. They emerged into the schoolyard just as fire brigades were arriving. Danish civilians rushed forward to help, carrying injured children and searching through the rubble for survivors. The rescue operation continued for hours. Firefighters worked through the flames, pulling bodies from the wreckage. Parents arrived in a state of panic, screaming the names of their children. Some were reunited with survivors. Many more were not. By the time the fires were extinguished, 86 children and 18 adults had perished. It was the single deadliest incident involving civilian casualties in any RAF precision raid of the Second World War. Sister Teresa survived the attack, though she was badly injured by falling debris. She spent 3 months in a hospital recovering from her wounds. When she finally returned to the site of the school, she found only ruins. The blackened walls of classrooms where she had once taught mathematics, the twisted remains of desks where children had once sat, the silence where there had once been laughter. She never taught again. Instead, she devoted the rest of her life to working with orphaned children in Copenhagen, many of them orphans created by the war itself. She died in 1978 at the age of 73, still praying daily for the souls of the children she had been unable to save. The aftermath of Operation Carthage forced everyone involved to confront the moral complexity of what had happened. For the Danish resistance, the raid was an unqualified success. The destruction of the Gestapo files saved thousands of lives. The escape of key prisoners, including Mogens Fogh, preserved the resistance's leadership structure. And the psychological impact of the attack convinced many Danes that the war was truly entering its final phase. that liberation was coming. But for the families of the children who died at the Jeanne d'Arc school, no strategic calculation could justify what had happened. Their children had not been resistance fighters. They had not been prisoners of the Gestapo. They had been innocent bystanders, killed by bombs meant for someone else. The British government issued an immediate apology and offered compensation to the families. But what compensation could restore a child who would never grow up? What apology could heal a wound that deep? The pilots who had accidentally bombed the school were devastated. Most of them had not even realized what they had done until they returned to base and were debriefed. When they learned the truth, several suffered complete emotional breakdowns. Others continued flying but were haunted by nightmares for the rest of their lives. Group Captain Bateson, who had planned and led the mission, wrote a private letter to the families of the children expressing his profound sorrow and taking personal responsibility for the tragedy. The letter was never made public during his lifetime, but it was discovered after his death and revealed the depth of his anguish. "I know that my words cannot bring back your children," he wrote. "I know that no explanation can justify their deaths. But I want you to know that I have thought of them every day since March 21st, 1945, and I will think of them every day for the rest of my life. They were innocent victims of a terrible war, and their deaths will always be on my conscience." Bateson never fully recovered from the raid. Although he continued his career in the RAF after the war, those who knew him said that something had changed in him. The confidence that had made him such an effective leader was gone, replaced by a persistent melancholy that he could never shake. He retired from the RAF in 1958 and spent his final years in quiet seclusion in the English countryside. He rarely spoke about Operation Carthage, and when he did, it was always with a mixture of pride and profound regret. "We did what we were asked to do," he told an interviewer in 1972. "The resistance requested the raid. They knew the risks. They accepted the consequences. But those children at the school, they did not ask for anything. They did not accept anything. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they paid with their lives." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "I have asked myself 1,000 times whether the mission was worth it. I have weighed the lives we saved against the lives we took. And I still do not know the answer. Perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps war simply forces us to make choices that cannot be justified, only endured." Bateson died in 1979. At his funeral, a wreath was sent by the Danish government in recognition of his service to their nation's liberation. Another wreath came from the survivors of the Jeanne d'Arc school, a gesture of forgiveness that moved everyone present to tears. The legacy of Operation Carthage continues to resonate 8 decades later. In Copenhagen, a memorial now stands at the site of the former Shellhus building. It honors the resistance fighters who were held there, the prisoners who escaped, and the German personnel who died in the attack. Nearby, a second memorial marks the site of the Jeanne d'Arc school, listing the names of every child and adult who perished. Each year on March 21st, ceremonies are held at both sites. Survivors and descendants gather to remember what happened. Danish officials lay wreaths. British veterans, or their families, now that the veterans themselves have passed, attend to pay their respects. The ceremonies have evolved over the decades. In the early years, there was tension between those who celebrated the destruction of Gestapo headquarters and those who mourned the children of the school. How could the same event be both a triumph and a tragedy? But over time, a more nuanced understanding has emerged. The people of Copenhagen have come to accept that Operation Carthage was both a necessary military operation that saved many lives and a terrible accident that took many others. The two truths exist side by side, irreconcilable but both real. This acceptance has not come easily. It required conversations across generations, between survivors and descendants, between Danes and British veterans. It required a willingness to hold contradictory emotions simultaneously, gratitude and grief, pride and regret. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of Operation Carthage. War does not offer simple answers or clean moral categories. It forces impossible choices upon ordinary people and then demands that they live with the consequences. The best we can do is remember the courage of the pilots who flew the mission, the desperation of the prisoners who awaited execution, the innocence of the children who went to school on a March morning and never came home. The story of that day belongs to all of them. It is a story of sacrifice and tragedy, of victory and loss, of human beings doing their best in circumstances that offered no good options. It is, in the end, a story about what we are capable of, both the heights of courage and the depths of sorrow. As I reflect on Operation Carthage from the distance of 8 decades, I'm struck by how relevant its lessons remain. We still face choices between competing goods, between saving some lives and risking others. We still grapple with the moral complexity of violence, even violence committed in the service of liberation. The pilots who flew that mission did not consider themselves heroes. They were ordinary young men doing an extraordinary job, trying to end a terrible war as quickly as possible. They made decisions in split seconds that would haunt them for decades, and they lived with the consequences as best they could. The prisoners who escaped the shellos did not consider themselves lucky. They had lost friends and comrades in the cells around them. They had survived torture and faced execution. Their liberation came at a cost they never forgot. The children who died at the Jeanne d'Arc school were not symbols or statistics. They were individual human beings with names and faces, with hopes and dreams, with families who loved them. Their deaths diminished the world in ways that can never be measured. All of these truths coexist. All of them are a part of what happened on March 21st, 1945, and all of them deserve to be remembered. The Mosquito bombers that flew that mission are long gone now. Their wooden frames returned to the earth from which they came. The pilots who flew them have passed into history. Even the children who survived the school attack are elderly now, their memories of that day fading with time. But the story remains. It is passed down through generations, in ceremonies and memorials, in history books and documentaries, in conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten because it speaks to something fundamental about the human experience. We are capable of great courage. We are capable of terrible mistakes. We are capable of sacrificing everything for a cause we believe in. And we are capable of living with the consequences, even when those consequences break our hearts. That is the story of Operation Carthage. That is the story of those 18 Mosquito bombers flying at rooftop level through a city of 1 million people, trying to save lives and accidentally taking others. That is the story of Henrik Jensen, escaping from his cell through a crack in the wall. That is the story of Sister Teresa, leading her children through smoke and flames. And that is the story we must never forget. Because in remembering what happened at Copenhagen on March 21st, 1945, we remember what we are capable of, for better and for worse. We remember the price of freedom. We remember the cost of war. And we remember that even in the darkest moments of human history, there were people willing to risk everything for something greater than themselves. 8 Mosquito bombers, 11 minutes, a city transformed. That is the legacy of Operation Carthage. The final chapter of this story belongs to the city of Copenhagen itself, the city that witnessed both triumph and tragedy on that March morning, and that has spent the decades since trying to make sense of what happened. Copenhagen in 1945 was a city exhausted by 5 years of occupation. Food was scarce, fuel was rationed. Young men had been conscripted to work in German factories, and the Gestapo's shadow hung over every street corner, every whispered conversation, every suspicious glance. The raid on the Schelhus changed everything, not because it ended the occupation, but because it proved that the occupation could be challenged. For 5 years, the Germans had seemed invincible. Their control had been absolute. And then, in 11 minutes, the RAF had reduced their most feared institution to rubble. For the people of Copenhagen, the psychological impact was enormous. They had seen the impossible happen with their own eyes. They had watched British bombers fly through the heart of their city at rooftop level. They had seen the Gestapo headquarters burn. And they had understood, perhaps for the first time, that liberation was truly possible. But they had also seen the Jeanne d'Arc school destroyed. They had heard the screams of the children. They had watched parents frantically searching through the rubble for their sons and daughters. And they had understood that liberation would come at a terrible cost. The weeks following the raid were a strange mixture of hope and grief. The resistance operated more openly than ever before, emboldened by the destruction of the Gestapo files. German morale collapsed as soldiers realized that they could no longer hide behind the civilian population. And everywhere, people began preparing for the end they knew was coming. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Copenhagen erupted in celebration. People poured into the streets, waving Danish flags that had been hidden for 5 years. British troops arrived to oversee the handover of power, and the resistance fighters who had spent years in the shadows finally stepped into the light. But the celebration was tempered by memory. Even as people danced in the streets, they remembered the children who would never dance again. Even as they cheered the liberation, they mourned the price that had been paid. The funerals for the victims of the Jeanne d'Arc school were held in the weeks after the surrender. They were attended by thousands, Danish civilians, British soldiers, resistance fighters, even some German officers who had been moved by the tragedy. The sight of so many small coffins arranged in rows in the church was almost unbearable. Father Martin, the priest who conducted the services, struggled to find words equal to the occasion. In his sermon, he spoke of innocence and sacrifice, of tragedy and hope. But these children did not choose to be part of history, he said. They did not volunteer for martyrdom. They were simply children, going to school, learning their lessons, dreaming their dreams, and now they are gone, taken by a war they never asked for and never understood. He paused, looking out at the grieving families. But I believe that their deaths were not meaningless. I believe that they are part of the price we paid for freedom, a price so terrible that we must never forget it, so precious that we must never take it for granted. These children died so that other children might live in a free Denmark. They died so that future generations might never know the terror of occupation. He raised his hand in blessing. May their memory be eternal. May their sacrifice be honored. And may we, the survivors, be worthy of the freedom they helped to purchase. The words provided some comfort to the grieving families, though comfort seemed inadequate to the magnitude of their loss. How do you comfort a mother who has buried her child? How do you explain to a father that his daughter's death served a purpose he cannot fully comprehend? These questions haunted Copenhagen for years after the war. They became part of the city's collective memory, a wound that never fully healed, a scar that remained visible long after the physical damage had been repaired. But Copenhagen healed, as cities do. The rubble was cleared. New buildings rose on the sites of the old. A new generation was born, a generation that knew the war only through stories and photographs, through memorials and ceremonies. Today, Copenhagen is one of the most prosperous and peaceful cities in Europe. Its streets are filled with bicycles and tourists. Its restaurants serve some of the finest food in the world. Its citizens enjoy freedoms that their grandparents could only dream of. And yet, the memory of March 21st, 1945 remains alive. Every year on the anniversary, flowers are laid at the memorials. Stories are told to children too young to remember. Veterans, or their descendants, travel from Britain to pay their respects. The memory serves as a reminder of what was sacrificed to achieve the peace that Copenhagen now enjoys. It serves as a warning of what can happen when ordinary people are caught up in the machinery of war. And it serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to survive tragedy, to find meaning in loss, and to build a better future from the ruins of the past. One of the last survivors of the Jeanne d'Arc school was a woman named Anna Pedersen. She was 8 years old on the morning of the raid, a third grader in Sister Teresa's mathematics class. She survived because she happened to be in the bathroom when the bombs fell, in a corner of the building that remained intact. In an interview conducted in 2019 when she was 82 years old, Anna described what it was like to be a survivor. "For many years I felt guilty," she said. "Why did I survive when my friends did not? Why was I in the bathroom at that exact moment? There was no reason, no explanation. It was simply luck, random chance that saved my life and ended theirs." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But over time, I came to understand that survival is not a burden to be carried. It is a gift to be honored. I survived so that I could tell this story. I survived so that the memory of my friends would not be lost. I survived so that future generations would know what happened on that morning. Not just the heroism of the raid, but the tragedy as well." Anna devoted her life to keeping that memory alive. She spoke at schools and universities. She wrote a memoir that was translated into multiple languages, and she attended every anniversary ceremony at the Jeanne d'Arc Memorial, standing in silence beside the names of children who had once been her classmates. She died in 2022, at the age of 95. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, friends, family, students she had taught, historians who had learned from her testimony. The ceremony was held at the same church where her classmates had been buried 77 years earlier. In her final interview, conducted just months before her death, Anna was asked what she wanted people to remember about Operation Carthage. "I want them to remember that history is not simple," she said. "I want them to remember that the same event can be both heroic and tragic. I want them to remember that the people who flew those planes were not villains. They were young men trying to end a terrible war. And I want them to remember that the children who died were not symbols. They were real people, with real lives that were cut short." She looked directly at the camera, her eyes still sharp despite her age. "And most of all, I want them to remember that war has consequences. Every bomb that falls, every shot that is fired, every decision that is made, they all have consequences that ripple through time, affecting lives for generations to come. We must never forget that. We must never become so comfortable with war that we forget its cost." Anna's words serve as a fitting conclusion to this story, not because they provide easy answers, but because they remind us that easy answers do not exist. Operation Carthage was a military success. It destroyed Gestapo headquarters, saved thousands of resistance members from arrest and execution, and helped ensure that Denmark emerged from the war with its resistance movement intact. By any strategic measure, it achieved its objectives. But Operation Carthage was also a human tragedy. It killed 86 children who had done nothing wrong, who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. It left scars on survivors that never healed. It haunted the pilots who flew the mission for the rest of their lives. Both of these truths are real. Both of these truths deserve to be remembered. And both of these truths remind us of the fundamental paradox of war, that it can be both necessary and terrible, both justified and tragic, both heroic and heartbreaking. That is the legacy of Operation Carthage. That is what those 18 Mosquito bombers left behind when they flew home to England on the afternoon of March 21st, 1945. That is what the people of Copenhagen have been grappling with ever since. And that is what we must carry with us. The memory of courage and tragedy, intertwined forever, reminding us of what we are capable of, for better and for worse. Thank you for watching this story of incredible courage, impossible choices, and the enduring power of memory. If this story moved you, please share it with others who might appreciate learning about this remarkable chapter of World War II history. The people who lived through Operation Carthage, the pilots, the prisoners, the children, deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told. Until next time, remember that history is not just about dates and facts. It is about human beings, ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and did their best to survive. That is the story of Operation Carthage. That is the story of Copenhagen. And that is the story we must never forget.